Hello and welcome to this month's Rights in Russia English language interview. It's April 23rd, 2026, and today's guest is Teresa Cherfas, a documentary film producer and director who is specialized in making films about Russia and the countries of the former Soviet Union. After completing postgraduate Russian studies at Oxford University, Teresa worked at the BBC Russian service before becoming an independent filmmaker. Her film credits include Stalin, 1990, Last of the Czars in 1996, the Crimean War, 1997, and Babitsky's War in 2000, for which she was awarded an Amnesty International Best Documentary Feature Award. This was followed by the BAFTA award-winning documentary, Beslan, 2004, and the BBC five-part series, A Journey Through Russia with Jonathan Dimbleby. Together with director George Carey, she produced a series of single documentaries, Close Encounters in Siberia, about the Tunguska Meteorite, Hitler, Stalin, and Mr. Jones, about the Welsh journalist who revealed to the world Stalin's 1993 man-made famine, The Spy Who Went Into the Cold, about Kim Philby and Toffs, Queers and Traitors, about Guy Burgess, both members of the notorious Cold War spy ring, the Cambridge Five. She has traveled the length and breadth of Russia for her work. Since January 2023, she has been presenting a series of Russian language podcasts with Rights in Russia entitled Then and Now, looking at the changes Russia's full-scale war on Ukraine has wrought on both Russia and Ukraine. Welcome to Rights in Russia's English language interview, Teresa Cherfas.
Thank you, Mary.
So going back to the start of your career, so why Russia? Well, I might say Russia and the countries of the former Soviet Union. What awakened your interest in that part of the world?
I can't say there was a very, major factor when I began to learn Russian, which I did at school in London from the age of 14. I thought it was rather intriguing and romantic, and there was a sort of, impenetrable, I thought, alphabet that I could write in code in and things like that. But as I carried on learning Russian, I decided to go for my bachelor's degree to Sussex University. And the main reason that I chose to go there was that it was a 4-year course. And that meant that in the third year, they organized for the students to go to the country where the language they were studying was spoken.
Mhm.
And so I found myself at the age of 21, spending a year as a exchange student in Moscow, but not in Moscow State University, as so many students did, but working in a publishing house called Progress Publishers. And I can honestly say that it was just the most life-changing experience. There was so little known about everyday life, about people. It was all Kremlinology, deciphering what people in the Kremlin were doing, but there was very, very little known. And so every time I stepped out of the door of the flat where we were living, I felt like I was just like a sponge, absorbing every piece of information that I could glean from my eyes, my ears, from interactions.
Mhm.
And it was just a very, very thrilling and intense experience, during which I also could travel. So I went to Leningrad, as it was then. I went to Tallinn, which all my Russian friends suggested I should do because for them it was like Europe. For me, it was a bit boring because it was like Europe. But I also went on my own to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan.
Mhm.
And again, that was just the most, eye-opening situation because if I'd been wary, if you like, of the Soviet communist takeover of these countries, going to Uzbekistan, I realized that it was a completely different story for a nation the overwhelming majority of which had been illiterate before the revolution, hadn't had access to free education and medicine. And so it was just a sort of incredibly mind expanding experience. I'd also been at a university that was pretty left wing, where people were very, if you like, pro Soviet. And, it really redefined when I was a student there what real freedom meant, and freedom for people who didn't have it meant being able to spend your time as you wanted, meant being able to read the books that you wanted, meant being able to choose the kind of life that you wanted. And in a funny way, I suppose I was, and I still am, something of a feminist, but it just didn't have any purchase in Soviet Russia when I was there. Women would have loved to have stayed home and raised their children. They just couldn't. There was no way that you could be a stay-at-home mother. When somebody made a beautiful like table, as they say, with a delicious dinner, and the first toast would be to the marvelous housewife, if you like, by translation. And I thought, God, this is really backward, demented sort of thing. And then I asked one of my friends, I said, don't you feel that that's quite demeaning? And I remember her explaining to me, no, it's not at all. It's so difficult as a woman to make this kind of family occasion that it's a really wonderful toast because everyone understands the effort that's gone to buying the food, to making the food. None of this was easy. So it became just sort of a life-changing event.
Uh, so what about making documentaries? Was it something that you always wanted to do, or did you arrive at that at a later time of life, just using your expertise to make documentaries?
I think I think really I like the idea of finding things
Mm,
out. And I always thought that, researching and listening and finding things out was a really good way of spending time. And when I was at the BBC Russian service, I had a very satisfying job in the features department. But being English, amongst many who were native Russian speakers, people from the former,
mm,
well, what was the Soviet Union then, my job was much more in explaining England to our Russian listeners. And I
mhm,
was much more, if the truth be told, I was more interested in explaining Russia to English, an English audience. And so when in it was in 1988, I just literally saw a job advertisement in the Guardian newspaper that they were making a documentary series about Stalin and looking for researchers and producers. And I just thought this sounded like, a dream project to be involved in. Mostly as well, because up until then, nothing really about Stalin had been produced in the West, having had access to the Soviet Union. These things just didn't happen before that.
mhm,
And I suppose it was obviously because of perestroika and glasnost and Gorbachev and so on. And I got the job, I think, a lot largely to do with the experience that I already had, but also, funnily enough, to do with the fact that I had many contacts at the BBC
mhm.
Russian service. And and so when I got the job, it was just, a gift from heaven. I remember my boss saying, that it was almost ridiculous to be paid for doing the work that we were doing because it was just it was exciting, it was groundbreaking. I found myself, talking to people who'd never talked to their own family about what they'd experienced under Stalin. Obviously, there were
Mhm.
many different kinds of people we talked to, and not all of them were, victims of Stalinism. Many were, you know, party followers, policymakers, all that sort of thing. But it was at a time in
Mhm.
1989 when, the Russian press was first being flooded with stories of this kind. It was just, less than a year after Memorial had its founding meeting. And they were engaged in collecting testimony about it. So it was a very, very wonderful confluence of these kind of events. And, I wasn't driven by some great ambition. And in fact, I didn't realize that by taking this job, I'd lost, the great BBC pension and security of jobs and all that kind of thing. But I was lucky enough just to begin my path in documentary filmmaking
Mhm.
when Russia was really opening up and really, in a way, people were very trustful of someone coming from outside to talk to them.
Mhm.
So it then happened after that that there were more and more films that I was, lucky enough to be taken on to work on, and that's really how it started. So
Mhm.
I couldn't really say that I'm a sort of documentary filmmaker, right in my bones. It's Russia.
Mhm. Most of the documentaries you've made have focused on a particular moment or a period of special interest, yeah, in terms of history and society and politics. Could you say a little bit about how you go about choosing topics for a documentary? And then it would also it would be useful to hear how you choose the people that you're going to interview, right? I mean, how you make those choices.
Well, I should say that it's not been me that's chosen the topics. I
Hmm.
have worked on projects that have already been commissioned by broadcasters. So in those cases, it's more likely to be, a team in a production company with an executive producer who has a track record, etc., etc.
Hmm.
But when it comes to uh, finding people to interview, that's part of what is, so wonderful about this work. It's the contact with living witnesses to a moment in history. And in a sense, they're all different. In the Crimean War, for example, we were finding eyewitness accounts in written accounts and bringing them to the screen through actors' voices and things. One of the more interesting aspects of it, if you like, was when we were making The Last of the Czars about Nicholas II, who was the last emperor of the last Tsar of Russia before the revolution. My the series director on the project had this brilliant idea, as he thought, which was again to use witness testimony from written accounts of people who were long dead, and get Russian actors in costume to read them as though they were being interviewed. So they would be like period pieces, and then they would talk from verbatim, if you like, accounts that were published. And my job on that particular project consisted in getting real people who were by now very elderly to talk about episodes that they remembered from what would really be their childhood or adolescence, or in some very rare cases,
Hmm.
their early 20s, say.
Hmm.
And I did that in large part through contacting. A friend of mine gave me a wonderful tip, which was in Russia there exist old age homes retirement homes by profession. And she gave me this wonderful idea, which was to go to an old age home for actors. And the reason that this was so brilliant was that actors have very good memories and are very good storytellers. And so by going to a home for people like this, you only had to find someone in their 90s and say to them, what do you remember of your childhood, or do you remember this or that? And these wonderful, they came alive in a way that was just visible on camera. And I found several different witnesses like this, who talked about the young Tsarevich Alexei, who talked about even Rasputin, who remembered the 1905 Potemkin Rising, or, there was one guy who'd been at the Finland station when Lenin came in. And by filming them in modern dress and everything, we put them together with the filmed interviews of actors, I mean, of real actors reading words from books that were published later. And when it came to having a screening for the broadcasters, I remember very much that there was a Japanese lady from the Japanese broadcasters, NHK. And very quietly, she said she liked the screening very much, but she didn't want those actors because the real people were so much more vivid.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very, it was just an amazing realization that that feeling of just putting your hand out and touching history, that here were people in front of you who remembered the 300th anniversary celebrations in 1913 of the Romanov dynasty. People who were there, people who could describe what Nicholas's physical shape was and how Alexandra Fyodorovna, his wife, towered over him in a great hat. There were, so many little insights that made it unforgettable.
So your films have documented the changes that have taken place in Russia over the decades, in particular the 1990s and then in the 2000s under Putin. So what picture of these changes would you say that your films present?
I think it's very difficult to generalize. I mean, I've made a lot of films. They haven't been, I mean, perhaps, um, I'm trying to think. Perhaps the series, The Journey Through Russia, um, showed a lot about at that time. That was really, we filmed most of it in between 2005 and 2008. And there was still a feeling, that Putin was kind of okay. There hadn't been, the limitations on ordinary people's lives that there subsequently was. Um,
Mhm.
I had done various films in 1991, which were about the breakup of the Soviet Union in different ways. I was in filming in Latvia after I don't know if you know about this or remember it, after the Oman, the Russian, you know, soldiers had been in and caused havoc because of demonstrations in favor of Latvian independence. I spent a lot of time in 1991 in Georgia. I've spent time in Azerbaijan. So it's, I can't say that everything that I did was like, it wasn't news coverage. Do you see what I mean? It wasn't a news
Mhm.
story about the Soviet Union. But I spent the year of 1998 in Moscow, which was the year that
Mhm.
there was a default and there was great economic trouble. People lost money, their entire savings three times over, and so on. And I was working for a
Mhm.
BBC project in Moscow at the time, which was part of something called the Marshall Plan of the Mind, where they were helping, it
Mhm.
was helping local journalists to, to practice what we could bring to them as a sort of more
Mhm.
objective kind of journalism.
Mhm.
And I remember at that time, watching the Russian news, and it just felt every night felt like a kind of roller coaster, helter skelter, of some great disaster somewhere or other that had
Mhm.
human impact. So it was, in that sense, yes, a very rocky time, and I think also, just in personal relations, you become aware of people's children going astray, taking drugs, the unleashing of what had been a very sort of strict and ordered society was quite palpable, yes.
Mhm. So, but before their doubts about Putin began to arise, did you have any difficulty in talking with people? Were people fairly open? And
Yes,
did you ever try to interview people who said, "Well, I think I'd rather not," right?
much,
Because
much
they might be
later.
afraid of security?
Yeah,
Yeah.
only much later. I think that in the initial stages, I think people were very, very welcoming. And if anything, it was often, I felt, easier for me to interview people than maybe for some Russians, mostly because I was like a blank sheet. I was an English woman who spoke Russian, but they couldn't tell whether I was in favor or against. I had no, for them, there was nothing social that they could pick up about where I came from. Yes, I came from England. Yes, it was a BBC film or a Channel 4 film or whatever it was. But I found that people welcomed and talked to me almost as if I was a grandchild, say, and they were trying to explain what it was that had made them
Hmm.
act in one way or another. And I found that, very, very precious, really. But I think as time went on, in some cases, yes, there were people who felt more vulnerable or perhaps weren't so willing to be on the record or, occasionally. But on the whole, I must say, it was probably, easier than making similar films here. I can't compare because I haven't done that work here. But I
Hmm.
remember sometimes talking to colleagues and talking about getting documents or, dealing with the officialdom or something like that
Hmm.
and people saying, "Oh my God, you should try it in England. It's much more complicated." And of course, one of the amazing
Hmm.
things about Russia is that, there are so many rules and laws and regulations, but there are also always ways of getting around them or going with the flow. And of course, I have to
Hmm.
give due to the Russian fixers and local producers who we worked with, who were all amazing.
Hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask about did you ever have Russians who came along on the project that wanted to become filmmakers? Did you get
No,
the sense
we
that
we
there was an
worked with
opening for that?
no, we they didn't come along to want to be filmmakers. I made these single documentaries later, and in a way, they came out. The first one came out of making the series, which was very bulky. We had a British film crew, we had a British presenter, we had a couple of Russians, moving around with this group was
Hmm.
was big and cumbersome. And there were places and stories that we couldn't do because Russia is so vast, and just getting to somewhere quite remote might take a couple of days. You could get stranded there, and with a big crew and with a sort of celebrity presenter, you can't do those things. And there are health and safety, and we'd get asked by crew members, whether the boat that we were taking along some part of the Ob River, had insurance. I mean, questions that, all right, they felt they could ask, but were very
Mm-hmm.
difficult to answer. And I had been working with a wonderful journalist in Tomsk who worked for the Tomsk TV2, which was a very kind of independent, fantastically, you know, in liberal kind of TV channel, local TV channel. And she wrote to me after we'd finished the series with Jonathan Dimbleby saying, what about making a film for the 100th anniversary of the Tunguska Meteorite? I'd never heard of the Tunguska Meteorite. It's the sort of story that every Soviet schoolboy has grown up knowing about, but I hadn't heard of it. And I asked her to tell me more, and it became the first film that we did. I did with my colleague George Carey, which he referred to as guerrilla filming, and the reason being it was just two of us, having had this big and bulky crew. It was just, in fact, three of us, him, me, and Yulia from Tomsk. And she filmed, and George filmed, and I did sound recording. And it was just fantastic. And, we got fantastic access to people. And talk about transport. We rode in a helicopter with reindeer going back to where they landed. And, so there were different ways of making different films. And of course, local Russian journalists or, people, sometimes they would be from, other academic backgrounds were key, crucial colleagues. Yes.
You've been making these series of podcasts about the impact of Russia's full-scale invasion on Russia and on Ukraine. What do you think your listeners can learn from these podcasts? Can you
I'm
just
very
tell us a little bit about it?
Yes. Uh, Simon asked me to if I'd like to do it. They're in Russian, and I think it's one of those situations. Perhaps because I've worked freelance for so long, you learn never to say no. So I think I said yes, thinking I'll give it a go. And yeah, I think it's 3 years now I've been doing it. And uh, and it seems to be okay. It was my idea to call it Тогда и сейчас, which means then and now, because it felt
Mhm.
like the um, the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, was like a kind of Rubicon moment, of course. And the idea was to see how it had changed people's lives. And in the case of many Russians, it was the moment when they decided they couldn't live there anymore or work there anymore. In the case of some of the Ukrainians we spoke to, but obviously many that, thousands that we haven't spoken to, it was an
Mhm.
absolute rift in their lives, whether they
Mhm.
fled, whether they lost family, whatever it was. Um, and, to be honest, I talked to quite a variety of people. So I would find it difficult to say what someone might learn from it or take away from
Mhm.
it. But I hope, as one does with all this kind of work, that what they might take away from it is a kind of
Mhm.
compassion for a human story, because I think when you get into situations of conflict, you get this kind of rather blunt image of somebody that is an enemy or somebody, whether that's even an internal Russian enemy or not. So I think it's important, to bring out as much as possible people's thoughts and experiences at this time. But they're not all personal stories. Some are to do with
Mhm.
ideas or books or films and so on.
Mhm. So I just want to go back now to some of the documentaries that you've made. I mean, they've won awards. It's such a great list. And I'm wondering, do you have a sense of how many of these, or to what extent they were shown in Russia?
To be honest, I've no idea. Um, I can't remember if any of them were shown in Russia. That wasn't, on television. But a lot of them have been put on YouTube, not by me or by my colleagues.
Mhm.
Some might have been done officially. Many are just
Mhm.
done as they are. And so until recent interruptions with YouTube or interference with YouTube in Russia, people could have watched them, but I don't know.
And so for my final question, do you think it would be possible to make documentaries such as those that you've made, to make these kinds of documentaries in Russia in the future?
Um, if you're talking about non-Russians making them,
Hmm.
it will take, I think, a long time because there's a huge hostility to Westerners and to people from Britain in particular, to the BBC, to all these things. So I think, it would take not just a change of regime probably, but a whole kind of generation of people finding that the West isn't quite so devilish anymore. As far as for people making documentaries inside Russia, I think if they were to be political, it would be, yeah, suicide, impossible for a long time to come.
Hmm.
And in fact, I think the whole landscape of journalism and documentary making and whatever you like to call it in that sphere of reporting from Russia, took a complete nosedive when Evan Gershkovich was arrested for spying, because there'd always been a vague assumption that if you were a foreigner, that in itself would protect you from more extreme repercussions. You'd think, well, the worst that could happen is they'll send me on a plane back home. But when this Wall Street, I think he was Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, I can't
He was
remember.
Wall Street Journal.
Well,
I think it
yeah,
was Wall
when
Street
he
Journal.
was arrested and accused of spying, for everybody, it was a complete game changer about
Yeah.
how safe or desirable it would be to go in under any kind of visa, actually, but certainly not a tourist visa. I mean, when we
Mhm.
were working, by all the kind of rules and regulations, you should always have had an accredited journalist visa, but they weren't always easy to get. And, I've been in on a business visa, for example, and still done the work that I've done, or, probably not a tourist visa. But do you see what I mean? And now I think it would be far too difficult and dangerous. And even if
Yes.
you could get in there, of course, the fear of people to talk to you about things that mattered, I think would be insurmountable, difficult.
Hmm. Well, such a shame. But listen, I want to thank you, Teresa Cherfas, for sharing the insights gleaned from your really incredible documentary filmmaking career. We wish you
Thank
the
you.
best as you continue to keep Russia, its history, and its people in the public eye. So
Thank you.
thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.